Blood had already touched the pavement before anyone chose to look. Not in a dramatic splash, not enough to stop traffic, just a darkened smear near the curb where rainwater had thinned it into something almost polite. The kind of mark that could disappear by morning, erased by weather and indifference. The kind that did not make headlines. The kind that only mattered to the person who had bled. The city did not pause. Neon signs kept pulsing. A bus exhaled at the corner. Somewhere above, windows glowed with private lives that had nothing to do with what had just happened on the street below. Violence, in this place, did not arrive with ceremony. It slipped in quietly and waited to see who would notice. She stood a few steps from the stain, motionless, as if her body had not yet decided whether it was allowed to move. The cold air burned her lungs. Rain hovered in the atmosphere without falling, turning the night into something metallic and tight. Her hands were steady only because she had learned how to make them so. Shock had already passed through her once years ago when fear was still unfamiliar. What remained now was control, survival, calculation. She had learned how to leave scenes like this without being seen. The university rose behind her, clean and indifferent. Stone buildings, white lights, trimmed hedges. The campus did not acknowledge what happened at its edges. It existed on rules, credentials, and the quiet confidence of institutions that believed themselves above the city's disorder. Inside those walls, violence was theoretical. Outside them, it left marks on skin and pavement. She crossed the invisible line between the two worlds without looking back. From a distance, she looked intact. Her coat was buttoned, her hair controlled, her posture sharp. Anyone passing would have seen a young woman returning home late from studying, tired but composed. They would not have seen the faint tremor in her shoulders, the way her jaw was locked too tightly, the careful angles she used to keep the streetlights from revealing what lay beneath makeup and fabric. Her face carried traces of what she refused to name. Fatting bruises at the edge of her cheekbone. Slight swelling near her lip that she had concealed with practiced precision. Marks that were no longer fresh enough to invite questions, but not yet old enough to be forgotten. She had become skilled at making damage look accidental, at transforming pain into something socially acceptable. Behind her walked a past that no longer pretended to be love. The man who waited in her life had not always been this way. At least that was the version she carried for years, the story that made endurance feel meaningful. Control had entered quietly, disguised as protection. Jealousy had been called devotion. Anger had been called concern. Each boundary crossed had been followed by an apology, then a promise, then a brief return to something that resembled the beginning. She had told herself that relationships were complicated, that loyalty required patience, that struggle was proof of depth. What she had not admitted, even to herself, was how small her world had become. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. She did not look. She already knew what waited on the screen. Questions disguised as care. Accusations framed as worry. She had learned that responding too quickly fed the cycle. Silence, at least, gave her a few minutes of air. The night pressed close around her as she moved away from the campus lights. The city smelled of wet concrete and overheated engines. Sirens echoed distantly, not near enough to matter. Every surface reflected something broken. Neon signs stretched across puddles, street lamps fractured into trembling lines. Even the darkness seemed restless. She had not planned for the confrontation. It had found her anyway. The moment replayed with brutal clarity, his voice sharp in a place where it did not belong, his hand too close, the sudden escalation that turned fear into impact. It had not lasted long. It never did. Violence for him was never about duration. It was about reminder, about reestablishing gravity, about teaching her again where the center of her life was supposed to be. And then something unexpected had happened. A car had slowed, doors had opened. Light had cut through the dark, not the kind that erased danger, but enough to disrupt it, enough to make the moment visible. enough to remind him that the world did not end where his control began. For the first time in years, someone had not looked away. She did not yet understand what that would cost. Several blocks away, another man moved through a different kind of night. His office was silent except for the faint hum of electricity and the distant rhythm of rain against glass. Stacks of legal briefs lay arranged with careful order across his desk. Every object occupied its assigned place. His life had been constructed the same way, structured, efficient, disciplined. Disorder was something he analyzed, not something he allowed inside. He had built his reputation on precision. Students feared his exams. Colleagues trusted his judgment. Administrators relied on his reliability. In a profession shaped by argument and conflict, he had become known for control, for restraint, for never allowing personal impulse to cloud professional boundaries. The divorce had not shattered him. It had simply removed something that had once filled space. In its absence, he had added more work, more hours, more distance. Emotion had always been something he kept behind glass, observed rather than experienced. Structure had never failed him. People had. That night, he had stayed late without noticing the hour. A case file lay open before him, margins filled with meticulous annotations. His attention was complete. Focus had always been his defense against anything he did not wish to feel. When the campus security alert flashed briefly across his screen, he had registered it without urgency. A disturbance near the southern boundary. Minor incident, likely already resolved. The institution had protocols for these things. Systems existed so that individuals did not have to become involved. And yet something about the notification lingered. He did not know her yet, not by name, not by history. He had only seen her in passing in lecture halls and corridors, a presence that did not blend easily into the academic background. She moved differently than most students, more alert, less careless. When she challenged arguments in class, it was not for attention but for precision. There was a sharpness to her that did not feel performative. He had noticed, too, what others had not commented on. The way her eyes scanned rooms before settling. The way her posture never fully relaxed. These were not the habits of arrogance. They were the habits of someone who expected the world to turn without warning. At the edge of the campus, their worlds collided. He did not arrive as a hero. There was no dramatic instinct guiding him, only an interruption. A moment when the order he believed in was visibly breaking down. He saw the imbalance immediately. One figure imposing, one figure withdrawing. The kind of scene that institutions preferred not to acknowledge, the kind that usually dissolved when no one interfered. He did not raise his voice. He did not make promises. He did not offer comfort. He simply placed himself where the system had failed. The aftermath was quiet. No crowds, no applause, just the city resuming its rhythm, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred. The man who had brought violence retreated into the night, already planning his next assertion of control. The woman remained, her breathing shallow, her composure held together by will. For a moment, neither of them spoke. What passed between them was not intimacy. It was recognition. He saw not a victim, but a mind that refused surrender. She saw not a savior, but a presence that did not exploit her weakness. There was no romance in it, only the stark awareness that something irreversible had begun. The blood on the pavement was already fatting under the city's thin layer of moisture. By morning, there would be no visible trace, no record, no evidence that the night had almost taken something from her that could not be returned. But damage does not require witnesses to be real. She left that place with a new understanding of risk. He returned to his office with an unfamiliar weight pressing against the structure of his carefully ordered life. Neither of them yet named what had occurred, but both knew that the encounter had crossed a boundary that rules alone could not contain. From that moment forward, the story could no longer remain private. It had entered a space where reputation, power, and survival would collide, where protection would demand sacrifice, where love, if it came at all, would not arrive as salvation, but as a choice made in full knowledge of its cost. The city continued to glow. The campus returned to silence. And somewhere between those two worlds, a line had been drawn that neither of them would be able to step back across unchanged. She did not ask to be rescued. She asked for a chance. The distinction mattered to her more than anything else. Rescue implied weakness, a surrender of agency, a narrative where someone else became the center of her survival. A chance, however, meant authorship. It meant that whatever came next would still belong to her. When she stepped back onto the campus after that night, she did so not as a woman waiting for protection, but as someone who had calculated the narrow corridor still available to her and chosen to walk it. The assistant position in his office was not a romantic invitation. It was a structure, a foothold, a way out that did not require explanations or confessions. For her, it represented distance from the streets that remembered her fear, from the apartment where control had been disguised as intimacy, from the version of herself that had learned to endure rather than to decide. It was employment, proximity to institutional power, and the promise of legal literacy sharpened into defense. It was, quite simply, a strategy for survival. For him, the selection process had begun as procedure. Dozens of candidates, transcripts, recommendations, research samples. Excellence measured by metrics he trusted. The kind of decision he had made countless times before, free of emotional interference. Yet when he reviewed her work, something disrupted the neat alignment of criteria and outcome. Her writing was not merely precise. It carried urgency. Each argument seemed sharpened by necessity, every footnote anchored in something beyond academic ambition. It read like a mind that had learned the law not as abstraction, but as potential armor. He recognized the internal war she did not speak of. It was there in the way she structured her analyses, anticipating opposition before it appeared, building defenses into every conclusion. It was there in the economy of her language, in her refusal to waste words. He had taught long enough to distinguish discipline from desperation. What he saw in her was not fear, but a relentless insistence on control over her own future. When the offer was extended, it carried no warmth, no encouragement, only parameters, responsibilities, expectations. She accepted without hesitation. There was no gratitude in her expression, only focus. The contract was not emotional, it was functional. She began working, as though time itself were an adversary. The law library became her sanctuary. Long tables under cold light, the quiet hum of ventilation, the constant presence of texts that promised order in a world that had never offered her any. She arrived before the doors fully opened and left after the last custodians passed through. Every case she reviewed, every statute she memorized, every argument she refined was treated as a step further from the life that had almost swallowed her whole. Nights tested her endurance. The silence of the library was not gentle, it was oppressive, forcing her thoughts into sharper relief. The past did not retreat simply because she had changed locations. It followed her into the margins of legal briefs, into the spaces between sentences, into the pauses where exhaustion loosened her control. She countered it the only way she knew how, by working harder, by making her mind louder than memory. He observed her without intruding. His supervision was methodical, distant, structured. Tasks assigned, deadlines enforced, performance evaluated without indulgence. He did not soften his standards because of what he had witnessed that night. If anything, he demanded more, not as punishment but as confirmation. If she were to remain in this space, she would do so by merit alone. Protection could not replace competence. He would not offer her a refuge built on sympathy, only on structure. And yet, beneath that discipline, his attention was exacting. He noticed the patterns of her exhaustion, the way she compensated for fatigue with increased precision, the way she never left a document half complete. He noticed the changes, too. The gradual easing of tension in her posture when she worked late in his office, the way her shoulders lowered when the building grew quieter, as if the institutional walls themselves offered a form of shelter. He did not comment on any of it, but he accounted for it in how he assigned work, in how he calibrated pressure. Her past refused to remain contained. The man who had once claimed her loyalty did not accept the recalibration of her life. The distance she created was interpreted not as departure, but as provocation. Messages arrived at irregular intervals, each one designed to reassert relevance. The tone shifted from concern to accusation, from accusation to threat, in a progression she recognized too well. She did not respond. Silence was the only boundary she trusted, but boundaries had never stopped him before. He appeared where he should not have been, near the edge of campus, across the street from buildings where she worked late. In reflections she caught in windows, in the subtle shifts of atmosphere that preceded his presence. He did not confront her directly. He did not need to. The message was in the proximity, in the reminder that geography did not protect her, that he still believed her life belonged within the orbit he had defined. Fear returned, not as panic but as awareness. She learned to read the environment with heightened precision, to adjust routes, to change schedules, to memorize exits, to treat every walk home as a calculation of risk. The institution that had offered her opportunity could not offer her invisibility. The law promised justice in theory, but justice required evidence, documentation, process, none of which moved fast enough to match the immediacy of threat. Once again, he was there. Not as a rescuer, but as an operator. He did not dramatize the situation. He did not offer emotional assurances. He asked for details, times, locations, frequency. He listened as one listens to a problem that must be solved, not a story that must be felt. His response unfolded in systems, security protocols, formal reports, temporary housing arrangements that placed her beyond the reach of familiar routes. He did not frame it as protection. He framed it as procedure. It was not romance. It was logistics. For the first time, she experienced safety not as a fragile promise, but as an engineered condition. Surveillance, documentation, institutional authority applied with deliberate intent. She did not need to explain herself. She did not need to justify her fear. It was treated as valid by default. That alone altered something fundamental within her. Between them, there were no confessions. There was only proximity shaped by purpose. She worked, he reviewed, she refined, he challenged. Their exchanges were sparse, precise, stripped of anything that did not serve the task. Yet within that restraint, something else took form, not affection, recognition, a mutual awareness of what it meant to survive by structure rather than surrender. She began to sense, for the first time, what it meant to exist in a space that did not seek to diminish her. There were no raised voices, no sudden shifts of mood, no demands disguised as care. The environment of his office was not warm, but it was stable. Predictability became a form of relief she had not known she was allowed to desire. He, in turn, encountered something unfamiliar. Her presence did not ask anything from him that he could not define. She did not seek comfort, admiration, or validation. She sought clarity, direction, a framework within which to operate. It unsettled him precisely because it did not mirror the emotional patterns he had learned to navigate or avoid. She was not chaos. She was intensity without manipulation, purpose without performance. The nights they worked late were marked by silence that was not empty. Papers shifted, screens glowed, rain traced patterns down the windows. The city outside continued its restless movement, but inside, time narrowed to the careful alignment of thought and effort. He did not look at her as a woman. She did not look at him as a man. They regarded each other as two forces moving along intersecting vectors, aware of the collision that might occur if either deviated. And yet the awareness persisted. Not as desire, but as tension. The kind that arises when two people recognize in each other something they have long denied themselves. For her, It was the experience of being unbroken by proximity. For him, it was the presence of someone who did not require him to perform control as armor. In the quiet between tasks, in the shared endurance of long hours, something unspoken accumulated. It was not a spark, it was a current. She felt it first in absence. On nights when she left the building alone, when the city resumed its unpredictable choreography, when the threat of her past hovered at the periphery of her awareness. The security measures helped. The documentation created distance. But what remained with her was the memory of that controlled space, of being seen not as damage but as potential. He felt it in disruption. His life had been constructed to minimize intrusion. Work, routine, distance. Yet her presence did not conform to those boundaries. Not because she crossed them, but because she altered their meaning. The office that had once been an extension of his solitude became a place of shared labor. The silence that had protected him from emotion now carried an unfamiliar weight. Not longing, but something more dangerous, significance. He did not pursue it. He did not analyze it. He cataloged it as risk. For both of them, the connection remained unarticulated. There were no promises, no gestures that could be mistaken for intimacy, only a deepening alignment of purpose, an increasing awareness of each other's gravity. She trusted the structure he provided not because it belonged to him, but because it functioned. He respected her resilience not because it moved him emotionally, but because it was formidable. They stood, unknowingly, on the edge of something that would not allow neutrality. The man from her past did not disappear. He adapted. The messages became more calculated, the appearances more deliberate, the implication clear. The system she now relied on could not shield her from his determination forever. Each encounter was a reminder that control, once challenged, rarely relinquished itself quietly. She did not tell him everything, not out of secrecy, but out of habit. She had learned long ago that survival often required compartmentalization. Yet he saw enough to understand that what followed her was not simply unresolved history. It was an active threat. His response did not waver. He tightened procedures, adjusted access, ensured that every step she took within his professional sphere was documented, defensible, protected by institutional language. He did not frame these actions as personal, but they were precise in ways that revealed a deeper investment than protocol required. What formed between them was not safety alone. It was alignment. Two people who understood that the world did not bend to desire, only to structure. That survival was not accidental. That protection was not a feeling, but an architecture built from choices that carried consequences. She did not fall into him. She moved beside him. He did not claim her. He positioned himself where systems could be leveraged against what threatened her. In the stillness of those nights, under the sterile glow of office lights, the contract with darkness was signed not in words, but in sustained proximity. In the mutual decision to stand where danger existed rather than retreat from it. In the understanding that what they were constructing was not love in any traditional sense. It was something more dangerous. A partnership forged not in hope, but in the refusal to be broken. And from that refusal, something began to grow that neither of them could yet afford to name. Their connection did not begin with touch. It formed in the narrow hours that stretched past midnight, in corridors emptied of voices, in offices where light remained long after the campus had gone dark. It existed first as proximity shaped by purpose. Paper passed between them. Screens glowed. Arguments were refined, dismantled, rebuilt. What bound them was not attraction but concentration, the shared discipline of two minds moving toward the same precision. She learned to trust, not because he asked for it, but because he never demanded it. In his presence, nothing was required beyond the work itself. There were no emotional negotiations, no sudden shifts in tone, no hidden expectations disguised as care. The structure he offered was impersonal in form, but unwavering in execution. For someone who had lived inside a relationship where attention had always carried conditions, the absence of that pressure was disorienting. Trust did not arrive as a leap of faith. It arrived as repetition, as consistency, as the quiet realization that the space around her no longer contracted when she entered it. He, in turn, began to relinquish the version of control he had perfected over years of professional distance. His authority had always been rooted in separation, a clear line between himself and others, between personal and professional, between involvement and observation. With her, that separation blurred in ways that unsettled him, not because she crossed boundaries, but because she existed in the margins of them. She neither challenged his authority nor submitted to it. She met it with competence, with an intelligence that did not require approval. In the long hours of shared work, he found himself adjusting, allowing silence to extend rather than cutting it short, letting a task remain unresolved until her analysis was complete, trusting her judgment in areas where he would once have intervened. These were small shifts, almost imperceptible, but they accumulated. And with each one, the control he had relied on as armor loosened, not into chaos, but into something more dangerous: openness. Around them, the institution remained indifferent. The university functioned as it always had, its structures indifferent to individual currents beneath its surface. Faculty meetings, departmental evaluations, administrative memos. The machinery of reputation and protocol moved forward, blind to anything that did not announce itself loudly. Yet not everyone was blind. There were glances that lingered too long when they left the building together. Colleagues who noted the frequency of her presence in his office. Assistants who marked patterns where none were supposed to exist. He sensed it before it became explicit. A shift in atmosphere, the faint awareness that attention had turned in their direction. The institution did not forgive ambiguity. Within that world, power was a visible structure, vulnerability an unacceptable variable. Relationships between those who held authority and those who did not were not evaluated on intent, but on optics. It did not matter what was true. What mattered was what could be perceived. The mere suggestion of impropriety was enough to damage reputations built over decades. The rules were designed to prevent abuse, but they were enforced without nuance, without room for context. In such a system, closeness itself became suspect. He understood this better than most. His career had been shaped by the careful navigation of institutional boundaries. He knew the cost of misinterpretation, the speed with which rumors hardened into record, the way oversight committees transformed personal complexity into policy violation. The thought of becoming the subject of that scrutiny did not frighten him. It repelled him on a deeper level. He had built his life on the premise that discipline could insulate against such chaos. And yet, discipline did not account for her. She felt the weight of that scrutiny differently. For her, the risk was not merely professional. It was existential. Her position in the university was not inherited. It was not protected by legacy or networks. It was something she had fought for, line by line, argument by argument. Any suggestion that her presence in his office was earned through anything other than merit threatened to reduce her work to rumor, to recast survival as opportunism. She began to notice the shift in how others regarded her. Conversations that paused when she entered rooms, subtle changes in tone, questions framed as casual that carried a sharper edge beneath. She did not respond to them. She had learned long ago that reacting often gave suspicion the substance it lacked, but internally the awareness grew. The world they were navigating was not neutral. It was watching. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, their connection deepened. It did not do so through confession or emotional release. It deepened through endurance. Through the shared strain of long nights, the mutual respect forged in intellectual confrontation, the quiet recognition of each other's solitude. They existed in a space that was neither friendship nor romance, but something more charged. a suspended state where meaning accumulated without being named. For her, the most profound shift was internal. She had spent years calibrating her behavior around volatility, anticipating reactions, managing tone, softening herself in order to minimize harm. In his presence, none of that was required. She did not have to measure her words for emotional impact. She did not have to adjust her opinions to preserve peace. Her mind could operate at full intensity without consequence. That freedom was intoxicating in a way that had nothing to do with desire. It was the freedom to exist unpunished. For him, the shift was equally destabilizing. He had long believed that distance equaled safety. That emotional containment was the price of control. Yet in working beside her, he discovered a form of closeness that did not threaten his autonomy. She did not seek to dismantle his structure. She moved within it with her own formidable discipline. The result was not intrusion, but alignment. A sense that his carefully ordered life had encountered something that did not disrupt its architecture, but revealed its limitations. The past, however, did not release her. Her attempts to confront it through formal channels intensified. Documentation, reports, legal petitions. She approached the process with the same rigor she brought to her academic work. Each filing was precise, each statement calibrated. She refused to frame herself as helpless. She framed herself as a subject asserting jurisdiction over her own life. The man who had once defined her world did not retreat. He learned the language of procedure quickly. He understood that paper could be manipulated, that the slow rhythm of institutional response created space for pressure to continue. He did not need to violate boundaries overtly. His presence in the periphery was enough. A figure across the street, a car that appeared too often, the sense of being observed, measured, reclaimed. Danger became ambient. It did not announce itself in dramatic moments. It embedded itself in the background of her days, a constant hum beneath every task. Each step through the city required calculation. Each return to her temporary housing carried the question of whether safety was still intact. The university offered security, but not sanctuary. Its walls did not extend far enough to contain what pursued her. He became aware of this not through her words, but through the subtle changes in her behavior. The way she paused before leaving the building, the routes she altered without explanation, the hypervigilance that resurfaced in moments of exhaustion. He did not confront her about it. He did not ask her to share what she was not ready to articulate, but his response was immediate and systematic. Additional safeguards, adjusted schedules. The quiet extension of his institutional authority into the spaces where threat lingered. The closeness that developed between them was therefore not born of comfort, but of shared exposure to risk. They stood increasingly in the same narrow corridor between order and chaos. For her, that corridor was the difference between reclaiming her life and losing it. For him, it was the boundary between professional integrity and personal commitment. Neither of them had planned to occupy that space, but once there, neither retreated. The boundary they eventually crossed was not sudden. It emerged through accumulation, through the growing recognition that what they shared could not be contained within the roles assigned to them, that the alignment of their lives was no longer incidental. It was chosen. The moment of realization did not arrive as passion. It arrived as clarity. They were no longer simply professor and assistant. They were two adults who understood the consequences of their proximity and had decided, in full awareness of those consequences, to remain where they were. The choice was not impulsive. It was deliberate, heavy with the knowledge of what it would cost. In that decision, there was no illusion of secrecy. They understood the world they inhabited. The institution would not interpret nuance. Colleagues would not suspend judgment. Administrative mechanisms would not pause for explanation. The relationship they were entering existed at the intersection of power and vulnerability, a place the system had been designed to police without mercy. And yet they chose it. not because they believed themselves exempt from rules, but because they refused to allow fear to dictate the architecture of their lives. They did not romanticize the risk. They did not imagine that love would soften consequences. They accepted, with the same rigor that had defined their work, that what they were doing would dismantle the order they had relied upon. For her, the choice was an assertion of agency in a world that had repeatedly attempted to define her by harm. She refused to let the violence of her past determine the limits of her future. If she was to build a life that belonged to her, it would be built without apology, even if that meant stepping into fire. For him, the choice was a renunciation of the protective distance he had mistaken for virtue. He had spent years constructing a life in which risk was managed through separation. In choosing her, he acknowledged that some forms of integrity required exposure, that to remain untouched was not the same as to remain whole. They did not announce their decision. They did not dramatize it. It simply became the reality within which they operated. Their movements grew more deliberate, their interactions more careful, not out of shame, but out of understanding. They were no longer only accountable to themselves. They were accountable to the consequences that would follow when the world inevitably noticed. The danger surrounding her did not dissipate. If anything, it sharpened. The man who pursued her past was not deterred by legal process or institutional boundaries. His persistence was not rooted in emotion, but in entitlement. He had learned to treat resistance as challenge, not refusal. The knowledge of this hung between her and the man who now stood beside her, unspoken but omnipresent. The line they had crossed did not protect them from what lay beyond it. It did not resolve the conflict between their private choice and the public structures that governed their lives. It simply redefined what they were willing to risk. What emerged between them was not the reckless abandon of forbidden love. It was something colder, sharper, and therefore more dangerous. A bond formed not in defiance of consequence, but in acceptance of it. Two people who understood that proximity could destroy them professionally, reputationally, and perhaps physically, and who nevertheless chose to remain aligned. In the silent corridors of the university, beneath the architecture of authority that neither of them could fully escape, they stood on the far side of a boundary that could not be uncrossed. The line was drawn. Not by passion, by decision. The exposure did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as accumulation. A glance that lingered too long, a corridor conversation that paused when they entered, a security report that noted patterns rather than incidents. The truth did not emerge because someone sought it. It surfaced because institutions were designed to detect deviation from structure, and their alignment had begun to register as anomaly. The first visible fracture appeared through technology. A camera mounted at the edge of a building recorded what the human eye had already suspected: proximity that could no longer be explained by professional necessity alone. It did not capture anything overt, no gestures that could be defended as indiscretion, only presence, repeated, sustained, unmistakable, the kind of evidence that gained meaning not through what it showed, but through how it could be interpreted. Images traveled faster than context ever could. Within days, speculation outpaced fact. Whispers moved through administrative channels, through faculty offices, through the spaces where reputations were not destroyed publicly, but recalibrated quietly. His name began appearing in internal correspondence, attached to words like oversight, risk, review. Hers surfaced in conversations where no one spoke of achievement, only of implication. The institution did what it had always done when confronted with potential scandal. It initiated process. Committees were convened, reports requested, documentation assembled. The university did not move with outrage or emotion. It moved with self-preservation. The goal was not to understand what had occurred between two people, The goal was to evaluate the threat they posed to the structure itself. Within that system, nuance was irrelevant. Power differentials were measured abstractly, without regard for intention. The existence of vulnerability in proximity to authority was treated not as context, but as liability. Their individual histories, their choices, the complexity of what they had built together were reduced to a set of questions designed to assess exposure. For the institution, they were not human beings navigating an impossible intersection of care and consequence. They were risk. He understood this immediately. He had spent his career inside that machinery. He knew the language it spoke, the logic it obeyed. There would be no space for personal narrative, no interest in moral intricacy. Only policy, optics, and the need to protect the university from legal and reputational damage. The very systems he had once trusted to uphold order now turned their focus upon him with clinical precision. Her position was more fragile. She was not protected by tenure or legacy. She did not possess the insulation of seniority. Whatever she had earned existed within a framework that could be revoked if her presence became inconvenient. The conversations that now surrounded her were not about her work. They were about what her proximity to him suggested. Her intelligence, her discipline, her survival were rendered invisible beneath the shadow of implication. She felt the shift immediately. The atmosphere changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Access delayed. Responses shortened. The sense that she was no longer moving through a neutral space, but through one in which every step was being catalogued, interpreted, weighed for damage. She did not respond outwardly. She had learned long ago that reaction often accelerated collapse, but internally the ground beneath her began to feel less stable. He made his decision before the process concluded. Not out of panic, out of clarity. He understood that any attempt to defend himself through technical argument would expose her to further scrutiny, that any effort to explain their connection in terms of intention or mutual choice would be reframed as deflection. The system did not seek accountability in the personal sense. It sought resolution in the institutional one. If one of them had to be removed to contain the risk, it would not be her. He prepared his response with the same precision that had defined his career. Documentation, statements, formal acknowledgement of responsibility, not framed as admission of wrongdoing, but as acceptance of consequence. He did not contest the process. He did not challenge the authority of the review. He positioned himself as the variable that could be eliminated without destabilizing the structure. Resignation became not surrender, but strategy. It was the only action that preserved what mattered most, her future. By stepping out of the system, he redirected its focus. He offered it a solution it could enact cleanly. The loss of a professor, even one with his reputation, was manageable. The removal of a student whose academic record was unassailable would invite complication. He chose the outcome that required the least sacrifice from her. The day the decision was formalized carried no spectacle. No public announcement, no confrontation, only the quiet finality of administrative procedure. His access to institutional resources was revoked, his name removed from internal rosters. Years of accumulated authority dissolved into a set of files archived under a process code. He did not experience it as defeat. He experienced it as alignment. The life he had built within the university had always been contingent on adherence to its structures. In choosing her, he had already accepted that those structures might no longer accommodate him. The loss was real, but it was not ambiguous. He had not been forced out by error. He had stepped aside deliberately, creating space for her to remain. She stayed. Not untouched by the process, but unexpelled. Her academic standing remained intact. Her work continued to speak for itself, even as whispers followed her through hallways. She was granted what he had intended, the chance to complete the life she was constructing, unbroken by institutional retaliation. The cost was not abstract. He lost the environment that had once defined him, the office where he had spent decades refining thought, the network that had anchored his professional identity, the subtle authority that came with belonging to a structure larger than oneself. What remained was a future uncharted, stripped of the protections he had once taken for granted. She remained in the space he had vacated, carrying both the opportunity he had preserved for her and the weight of what it had required. For a brief interval, it seemed as though the worst had passed. The institutional storm subsided, the reviews concluded, the machinery of oversight moved on to other risks. The city continued its restless movement. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of stability. That was when the past returned. Not as memory, as presence. The man who had refused to relinquish control over her life had not been deterred by procedural distance. If anything, the public disruption had sharpened his sense of entitlement. He interpreted her survival within the system as defiance. He interpreted his exclusion from her orbit as provocation. He chose a moment when she believed herself safest. The city was quiet, the kind of false calm that followed heavy rain. Streetlights cast elongated reflections across pavement. She moved through familiar routes with a vigilance that had never fully disappeared, but that had softened under the illusion of containment. He emerged from that illusion with calculated inevitability. The confrontation was not theatrical. It did not unfold in raised voices or public spectacle. It was sudden, intimate in the most violent sense. A reclaiming of space, of proximity, of the threat that had always underpinned his version of attachment. What she had escaped through law and structure, he sought to reassert through force. He was there before she could reorient. And he was not alone. The man who had once stood between her and the darkness did so again. Not as an authority figure. Not as a protector sanctioned by institution. As a body. As presence. He placed himself where harm was moving without calculation of personal cost. The distance between threat and target collapsed into a single, irreversible moment. Impact followed, not metaphorical, physical, immediate. The night recorded what institutions could not contain. Sirens fractured the silence. Light washed over pavement that had already borne witness once before. Blood marked the space where the boundary between decision and consequence had been crossed. This time, it did not fade into abstraction. It existed in visible measure, in the stark contrast between asphalt and red, in the reality of what it meant to stand between violence and the person it pursued. Hospitals did not interpret, they treated. Cold light, measured movement, the systematic response to trauma. For her, the world narrowed to the sight of him immobilized, the knowledge that what he had sacrificed professionally he was now risking physically. For him, consciousness receded into a landscape defined by pain and the certainty that the cost of their choice had become corporeal. The price of light was no longer theoretical. It had form. In that space, stripped of status and structure, what remained between them was neither romance nor regret. It was consequence. She had believed that survival could be negotiated through law, through proximity to power, through alignment with systems designed to protect. He had believed that sacrifice could be measured in titles, in career, in reputation. Neither had accounted for the persistence of violence that operated beyond institutional reach. The choice they had made had not merely altered their lives. It had exposed them. What followed was not resolution, it was reckoning. The city outside the hospital continued its indifferent rhythm. Neon still fractured across wet streets. Traffic still flowed. For most, the night remained only another sequence of hours. But for them, it had become the moment where light demanded its full price. Not in whispers. In blood. After the night when blood had marked the pavement, the world did not soften for her. It became sharper. The system she had once feared began to close around the man who had pursued her for years. What had been shadows turned into records, statements, timelines. Her father, the law, the machinery of investigation moved with a force that no longer felt abstract. Warrants replaced threats. Official language replaced whispered intimidation. The man who had controlled her life through proximity and fear was no longer a presence in the streets, but a subject in files, a name bound to charges that could not be dissolved by charm or denial. Yet liberation did not arrive as relief. It arrived as exposure. Every step toward justice required her to reopen what she had sealed inside herself. Each report, each recounting of what had happened, demanded that she translate years of private terror into structured narratives. What had once been instinct, avoidance, and survival became evidence. The law did not ask how she had endured. It asked what had been done, when, where, how many times. Pain was reorganized into sequence. Trauma was rendered into documentation. She learned that safety did not mean forgetting. It meant remembering in ways that no longer allowed silence to protect the wrong person. The process reshaped her from the inside. There were days when her body felt heavier than memory itself, when the effort to articulate what had once been unspeakable left her drained and distant from her own reflection. But she did not retreat. Each statement, each confirmation was another thread severed from the past. The fear that had defined her for so long no longer directed her movement. It resisted, but it did not command. For the first time, she was not running. He emerged from the hospital, carrying a different kind of weight. The injury had not simply broken flesh. It had dismantled the last illusions he had retained about control, about the limits of sacrifice. Lying beneath sterile lights, stripped of professional identity, removed from the architecture that had once defined his worth, he had confronted the reality that nothing external could shield what he loved. Titles had not stopped violence. Status had not prevented blood. What remained was clarity. The world he had constructed through discipline and authority had been real, but it had never been sufficient. His resignation had severed him from institutional power. The injury had severed him from the belief that he could calculate every outcome. Recovery was not just physical. It was existential. Each step, each breath reclaimed from pain, reinforced the knowledge that he was no longer who he had been, and that he no longer wanted to be. He returned to a life without scaffolding. There were no offices waiting for him, no students, no committees, no networks prepared to absorb him back into a familiar role. The structure that had once dictated his days was gone. What replaced it was uncertainty. Time no longer divided itself into obligations imposed by systems. It opened into something uncharted. He did not fill that space immediately. Instead, he learned to inhabit it. He rebuilt himself not through ambition, but through presence. The routines of recovery forced slowness upon him. Mornings that had once begun with schedules now began with physical effort. The pain reminded him that his body, not his status, was the instrument through which he now moved in the world. In that limitation, he discovered a kind of honesty that his former life had never required. They did not return to each other as they had been. The dynamic that had once defined their connection no longer existed. He was no longer the figure of authority she had worked beneath. She was no longer the vulnerable student whose future depended on his protection. The roles that had structured their earlier proximity had collapsed. What remained was the question neither of them had yet answered. Who were they without the forces that had first bound them together? Their relationship, no longer hidden, entered a different terrain. There was no secrecy to shield them from scrutiny, no professional barrier to explain their closeness. What they shared was no longer transgressive by position, but exposed by reality. They were simply two people carrying histories too heavy to be romanticized. They learned each other again. Not in stolen moments or in the charged quiet of institutional corridors, but in ordinary spaces that demanded honesty. Mornings shaped by recovery schedules. Evenings marked by fatigue rather than tension. The absence of urgency revealed what had always existed beneath the intensity, compatibility not built on crisis, but on recognition. She no longer needed to be protected. She was rebuilding herself with a strength that had not been visible when survival was her only objective. The legal process had forced her to articulate her experience. Therapy taught her to inhabit her body without flinching. Independence became not an aspiration, but a practice. She did not ask him to be her shield. She asked him to walk beside her. He did not attempt to reclaim a role of control. The instinct remained, embedded in years of structure and command, but he did not act on it. What he offered was not authority, but steadiness. He did not organize her life. He did not direct her choices. He respected the autonomy she had fought so hard to claim. In doing so, he confronted his own need to be needed, to be the one who intervened rather than simply remained. This shift was not seamless. There were moments when the past reasserted itself through reflex, when fear tightened her posture in crowded spaces, when he moved too quickly to anticipate danger. They did not ignore these fractures. They learned to recognize them as remnants of what they had survived, not as definitions of who they were becoming. The investigation progressed without their direct involvement. Charges accumulated, proceedings advanced. The man who had once dominated her reality was now confined by the very structures she had once believed incapable of protecting her. The knowledge brought neither satisfaction nor closure. It brought distance, a separation between her present and the life she had endured. She did not define herself by his absence. She defined herself by what she was building in its place. Academically, she advanced with a precision that no longer felt driven by escape. Her work was no longer fueled by the need to outrun danger, but by a genuine commitment to purpose. The discipline that had once been survival transformed into ambition that did not require justification. She was not proving anything to anyone. She was constructing a future that belonged to her. He supported her not as mentor, but as witness. He observed the evolution of her strength with an admiration that did not reduce her to what she had endured. He did not see her as a survivor in need of rescue. He saw her as a woman who had reclaimed authorship of her life. That recognition altered how he understood love. It was no longer defined by what he could give up for her, but by what he could stand beside without attempting to shape. Their intimacy matured into something less dramatic and more demanding. There were no illusions of rescue or destiny. What they shared was built through deliberate choice, reaffirmed not by crisis, but by consistency. They navigated the aftermath of loss together, his loss of identity, her loss of the person she had once been. They did not romanticize pain. They acknowledged it, then refused to allow it to dictate the terms of their connection. They existed outside the structures that had once governed them. No university, no hierarchy, no procedural boundaries. The world they now occupied did not offer scripts. There were no expectations imposed by institution or fear. What remained was the necessity of deciding, each day, how to be with one another. They chose to continue. Not because they were bound by what they had survived, but because what they were becoming together felt honest. Their relationship was no longer a refuge from danger. It was a partnership between two individuals who had learned that safety was not something given by systems or by others. It was something built, maintained, defended through mutual respect. There was no return to what had been. The lives they had lived before the night of violence were irretrievable. His career would not be restored. Her innocence would not be recovered. But neither sought restoration. What they wanted was forward movement, unencumbered by the need to fit into structures that had once constrained them. They did not retreat from what they had chosen. The path ahead was uncertain. It lacked guarantees, but it was theirs. In the absence of institutions, of imposed identities, of roles defined by fear or authority. They stood as two people who had crossed a line from which there was no return. Not because they had lost something essential, but because they had gained the one thing neither had possessed before: ownership of their lives. They moved into that future without illusion. Not saved, not redeemed, but awake. Time did what no institution, no investigation, no act of sacrifice could ever complete. It did not erase what had happened. It did not make the past smaller. It placed it behind them in a way that no longer dictated the shape of their days. She became a lawyer not because of him, but beside him. Her final years of study unfolded with a steadiness that surprised even those who had watched her fight through earlier chaos. The fear that once followed her through corridors no longer accompanied her steps. She moved through court buildings, libraries, and offices with a composure that did not ask permission. Her work carried the weight of someone who understood what law could fail to protect and what it could still make possible. She did not seek prestige. She sought precision. She did not chase visibility. She chose cases that aligned with the principles she had forged through pain. The profession did not soften her. It clarified her. She became known not for emotional narratives, but for disciplined advocacy. Her arguments were not loud, but they were exact. Judges listened because she did not waste language. Colleagues trusted her because she did not posture. Those who worked with her sensed the depth beneath her restraint, a quiet intensity shaped by experience that could not be taught. She did not build her identity on what she had survived. She built it on what she was now capable of. He found a place in the world that did not require him to hide behind a title. The transition was not immediate. The first months after leaving his former life were defined by absence. He was no longer invited into rooms where decisions were made by rank and reputation. His name no longer opened doors by default. The network that had once structured his influence dissolved into distant contacts and polite indifference. Yet the principles that had shaped him did not vanish with his status. He entered spaces where the law was not a hierarchy but a tool, where ethics were not abstract but operational. Consulting, advisory work, mentorship in smaller institutions that valued integrity over image. He discovered that his experience, stripped of institutional framing, still carried weight, not because of what he had been, but because of what he refused to become. People listened to him not for authority, but for consistency. In that shift, he found a form of belonging that his former world had never provided. There were no ceremonial recognitions, no public accolades. There was simply the work itself, and the knowledge that he was using what he knew in a way that aligned with what he believed. Their life together took shape not through dramatic gestures, but through accumulation. A shared apartment that was modest but deliberate. Furniture chosen for function rather than display. Evenings defined by quiet routines rather than social obligation. Mornings that began without urgency, without the shadow of surveillance or fear. The city still moved outside their windows. Traffic hummed through wet streets. Neon still cut through darkness. Sirens still echoed in distant neighborhoods. But the noise no longer felt like a threat. It was simply the sound of a world continuing. Inside, there was stability. Not perfection, but presence. They did not pretend that what had happened had been transformed into something noble. There were nights when memories surfaced uninvited, when she woke from dreams that carried the weight of old fear, when he stared too long at his hands, remembering what it had cost to stand between her and harm. They did not dramatize these moments. They acknowledged them. They let them pass without allowing them to define what remained. Her past became a scar, not a sentence. It did not disappear. It did not need to. It reminded her of where she had been, not of where she belonged. She did not introduce herself through that history. She did not allow it to become a narrative others could consume. It was simply part of her architecture, embedded but no longer structural. His losses became the price of a choice he did not regret. The career he had surrendered was not reclaimed. The world he had left did not call him back, and he did not seek return. What he had gained was not equivalent in visibility, but it was deeper in alignment. He did not measure his life by recognition anymore. He measured it by coherence between action and belief. Their relationship no longer existed in opposition to anything. It was not hidden. It was not defended. It was not defined by the fact that it had once been forbidden. It was simply there, present in small gestures that required no explanation. The way they moved through shared spaces. The way silence between them was not absence but understanding. The way decisions were made not through dominance or sacrifice, but through mutual consideration. They were no longer bound by the structures that had once shaped them. No university, no hierarchy, no institutional gaze. What they had was chosen, not imposed. She continued to grow into her profession with a confidence that did not require validation. She did not seek to correct the world, but she refused to accommodate its injustices. Each case she took carried the imprint of someone who understood both vulnerability and agency. Her empathy was disciplined. Her resolve was unromantic. Those who worked with her saw not a survivor, but a strategist. He watched her from a distance that was neither paternal nor possessive. He did not attempt to guide her career. He did not frame her success as something he had enabled. He simply stood beside her, offering what he had always offered when stripped of authority: steadiness. Their home reflected who they had become. There were no symbols of status, no remnants of his former world. There were books, not arranged by prestige but by relevance. Papers spread across tables during late nights of preparation. The quiet ritual of shared meals after long days. The window that looked out over the city, where light from passing cars painted the walls in slow, shifting patterns. The city still breathed outside. But inside there was warmth. Not the kind that promises safety from everything, but the kind that endures despite knowing how fragile safety can be. The warmth of two people who had faced what happens when the world does not protect you, and had chosen to build something that did not rely on illusion. They did not believe that love healed everything. They knew better. They understood that love demanded payment, in risk, in exposure, in loss, in the willingness to stand in uncertainty without guarantees. What they shared was not a fantasy of rescue. It was a discipline, a practice of choosing each other not because it was easy, but because it was honest. They had learned that the most dangerous feeling was not fear. It was closeness. Closeness required vulnerability without armor. It required the courage to be seen without titles, without defenses, without the structures that once dictated who they were allowed to be. In a world where power and violence existed side by side, where systems protected themselves before they protected people, choosing intimacy was an act of resistance. Not loud, not public, but real. They moved forward without mythology. There was no narrative of triumph, no declaration that suffering had been redeemed. What had happened remained what it was. What mattered was what followed. A life built not on what they had lost, but on what they refused to surrender: agency, integrity, and the right to define their own terms. In the evenings, when the city dimmed and the noise softened, they sometimes stood together by the window. The world below continued in all its contradictions. Power still existed. Violence still found its way into streets and homes. The structures that had once threatened them still operated according to their own logic. But inside that quiet space, there was something the outside could not touch. Not certainty. Not permanence. But warmth. The kind that remains after everything else has been stripped away. The kind that does not promise that nothing will ever hurt again, only that they would not face what remained alone. This was not a story about how love made everything right. It was a story about how love asked for everything, and how, in giving it, they found not safety, but meaning. In a world that had taught them the cost of closeness, they chose it anyway. And in that choice, in that fragile, deliberate act of being together where warmth remained, they claimed the only victory that had ever mattered to them. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.